Well, good evening. So good to see everybody this evening. I miss so much being with you this morning. As I said, I would a whole lot rather have been here with you than doing what I was doing this morning. Most of you have probably heard the news announcement by now that we had a young man that was killed in our community this morning, and I was there on the scene with the coroner's office for quite some time. But I just want to say, Mike and Don, thank you so much for your willingness to step in. I've heard wonderful reviews of both of your lessons, and aren't we thankful that we have men here at Pyburn Street that are willing and able to step in and to help out at a moment's notice. We appreciate so much your willingness to do that. But I'm glad to be here tonight. I love our question and answer nights. And I know that this is a night that many of you look forward to as well. We're going to jump right into our lesson for this evening. And we're going to start with a couple of questions that deal with a figure from the New Testament that we really don't know all that much about. We know he played a very important role whenever it came to fulfilling the prophecies concerning the burial of Jesus. But other than that, we really know very little about this man. And it starts out, the first part of this question has to do with the location that this man was from. The question is, where was Arimathea? And why is it not found on most Bible maps? And you know, when this question was asked of me, I had never noticed that. In fact, this was something that I had never turned to the back of my Bible and looked at the map, trying to find the city of Arimathea. But when I turned, I opened 3 or 4 different Bibles and looked at the maps that were there, and I did not find the city of Arimathea listed anywhere. Now, this has led some people to claim that, well, this is just a made-up place, that Joseph of Arimathea is just a mythical figure, and this just is a contradiction that's found in the Bible. Well, I find it very interesting that as I dug a little bit deeper, no one really knows where this city was located. And it's amazing to me that you go back and you look at so much of the archaeology and the cartography that's been done of that region. And some of that was done even during the time of the first century. And they were very meticulous in documenting many of these cities. But yet the city of Arimathea is one that we just don't come across. We don't see it on any of these maps. Now there are some that say, well, it's because it wasn't really a city, that it was more like a region. This is talking about a region in Judea. It's not a specific city. Therefore, unless you're looking at a map that shows the regions of Judea or the political regions of Judea, somewhat like what we would think of today as our townships here in our county. They say that if you're not looking at a map like that, then you're not going to find Arimathea. But I want to share with you what I was able to discover about this city. The only biblical references that we have to it are in the gospel accounts. In these references to this man named Joseph. Matthew 27:57, Mark 15:43, Luke 23:50, and John 19:38. And in each one of these passages, the only thing that is mentioned is that it is the hometown of this man by the name of Joseph. Joseph was described as being a rich man, a man who was a disciple of Jesus, and he was the man that had gone to Pilate and had requested the right to provide a proper burial for Jesus. Well, the text tells us that the Romans delivered the body of Jesus to Joseph. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new solid stone tomb. Well, guess what? This is all the Bible tells us about this man. And it's all the Bible tells us about the city of Arimathea. Now, any other information that we find has to come from non-inspired sources. Meaning the information that I'm about to share with you, while it comes from credible sources, it does not come from the biblical record. In the 4th century, a historian by the name of Eusebius said that the city of Arimathea came to be known as Ramathaim Zophim. I think I would have just stuck with Arimathea. But it came to be known by this long term. But they said that this was a city that was located in the land possession that had belonged to the tribe of Ephraim. But then Eusebius went a little bit further, and he said that this was the hometown of Samuel that we read about in the Old Testament. But that Arimathea was simply a short-lived name for this city. Well, in the 6th century, there was a map that was prepared. And ironically, this is the oldest map that has ever been discovered that includes the city of Arimathea. Like I said, I was not able to find any maps in the sources that I had. But online, I was able to find one source from the 6th century, a map known as the Madaba map. Includes Arimathea, but it also states that at that point, remember, in the 4th century, it had come to be known as Ramathaim Zophim, and I may not be pronouncing that right. But by the time the 6th century came around, 200 years later, it had come to be known as Beit Rima. And then 100 years after that, it came to be known as Bani Zayed. And Bani Zayed is still a city today that's located in the region of the Middle East known as the West Bank. But what complicates this a little bit more, during the years of the Crusades, as the Crusaders were documenting all of the places that they visited and all of the places where battles ensued with the Muslims in the Middle East, they talked about coming into a city by the name of Ramla, R-A-M-L-A, and they said that this city had been founded in the year 705 AD on land that had once been the possession of the tribe of Dan. So we see a difference there. Remember, Eusebius said that it had belonged to the tribe of Ephraim. Well, now the Crusaders are saying, no, this actually belonged to the tribe of Dan. But it said that this was a city that had been built upon the ruins of Ramathaim Zophim and Arimathea. So they actually mentioned the name Arimathea as having been at one time in this location. So in answer to the question, we really don't know the exact location where this city was. But due to the references that we have, we know that this was a city that was located in Judah, but it was a city whose name changed several times through history. And oftentimes what would happen was a new tribe of people would come in, or those from a different nationality would come in, and they would claim that territory. Well, they would go through and they would change the names of all of the cities to those that were more fitting to their culture or their gods or what have you. And so more than likely what happened was in the 1st century, this city was known as Arimathea. But as differing peoples came in and conquered that city, the name changed over time until eventually it was destroyed, and this city known as Bani Zayed was founded upon that site. Okay, so now we have a two-part question that continues along this same line of Joseph of Arimathea. And the first is, was Joseph of Arimathea a Jew or a Gentile? And you're going to see the importance of this point when we get into the second part of this question. Well, according to Matthew 27:57, we know that Joseph was a rich man who had become a disciple of Jesus. Luke 23:50-56 reveals that he was a member of the Sanhedrin Council, this Jewish governing council that was allowed to continue to exist by the Romans for the purpose of self-governing that nation of people. But also, we're told that even though he believed in Jesus, Even though he was a disciple, he was striving to follow Jesus, he was keeping his faith hidden at this point. The text says the reason for that was because he was afraid of the Jews. You know, as a member of the Sanhedrin, he would have heard everything that they were saying about Jesus. Everything that they wanted to do to Jesus. And so it's very possible that he was afraid for his life. He was afraid, well, if they find out that I am a disciple of Jesus, they're going to treat me the same way they're wanting to treat Jesus. And so for some reason, and the text doesn't tell us why, for some reason he kept that hidden. He was afraid of the Jews. But something to keep in mind, as a member of the Sanhedrin Council, as a native of a city in Judah, Joseph would have been a Jew. He would have been of Hebrew descent. But then, coming to the second part of the question, and this is where I think, at least in my opinion, this gets very interesting. If Joseph was a Jew, why did he touch the dead body of Jesus? Well, you may be wondering the significance of that. Well, we go back to Numbers 19 and verse 11. And we find that for those living under the law of Moses, Moses said, "He that toucheth the dead body of any man shall be unclean for 7 days." Well, the crucifixion of Jesus and the burial of Jesus took place on the day of preparation prior to Passover. So if a Jew touched the dead body of Jesus on that day, he would have been rendered unclean and unfit to observe the feast of the Passover. And so, here we see the significance of this question. If he was a devout Jew, and certainly we would say that those who were the followers of Jesus were continuing to live a life of devotion to those tenets in the old law. Why did he do this? Why did he render himself unclean? Well, some argue that Joseph just overlooked this. That he wanted to make sure that Jesus had a proper burial, and he really didn't care if it rendered him unclean or not. I don't know that I would be willing to go that far. Others believe that, well, since the old law was fulfilled when Jesus died on the cross, then this action would not have been sinful on the part of Joseph, and for that reason, he willingly touched the body of Jesus. But then others, and this is the point of view that I think really makes a lot of sense, others argue from the standpoint of the examples of Jesus. We go back and we look at some of the miracles that Jesus performed, and two of those in particular was when he raised a couple of young people from the dead. The first was the son of the widow of Nain in Luke 7 and verse 14, and the second was the daughter of Jairus in Mark 5 and verse 41. Well, guess what Jesus did on each one of those instances? He rendered himself unclean in the eyes of the Jews. Because with the example of the son of the widow of Nain, he comes up on the funeral procession. They're coming down the street carrying the body of this young man to the graveyard. And it says that he came up and he touched the bier or the platform that this young man was laid upon. But to the Jews, even touching that which a dead body was laid upon rendered you unclean. Well, the text specifically mentions that detail for some reason. It specifically mentions that Jesus went up and he touched that platform. Jesus would have been rendered unclean. This other instance with the raising of the daughter of Jairus in Mark 5 and verse 41, Jesus goes in and he takes the girl by the hand. You know, even if you tried to explain away the first, well, he didn't actually touch the body. Well, the second time he did. He took her by the hand. Now, is anyone willing to make the argument that Jesus was not faithful to the law of Moses? No. In fact, Jesus was the only person that ever lived perfectly according to the law of Moses. So in those instances, even though the law of Moses says that it's sinful, that it renders you unclean for 7 days, Jesus was able to rationalize this in some way. Well, most people believe that the way he was able to rationalize this is because he knew that when he touched that platform and when he touched her hand, they were going to come back to life. And so the argument could be made, well, he knew that they were not going to remain dead. Or he knew that people were going to look at that and they were going to speculate, well, maybe they weren't actually dead. Maybe when they came into contact with Jesus, they came back to consciousness or what have you. But whatever the case may be, we see that possibly this argument could be made that he did nothing wrong because they were not going to remain dead. And if that is the case, could Joseph not have made the same argument? It could be that Joseph's faith in Jesus and in the resurrection was so strong that he knew Jesus wasn't going to remain in the tomb. He knew. And following the examples that Jesus himself had set, he touched the body of Jesus. Now, once again, we don't know exactly why. We don't know what rationale he followed in determining that this is something that he would do. But what we do know was this was something he had to do in order to fulfill prophecy. Someone had to step in, and they had a very short period of time to carry this out. We talked about this quite extensively over a couple of weeks in our Sunday morning class. They had a very short window of time in which to get Jesus down from the cross and get him into the tomb in order for that Friday to count as one of those 3 days. And so someone had to step in and do it. No one else was doing it. Joseph had to in order to fulfill prophecy. Each of those prophecies, the one concerning how long he would be in the tomb, and the fact that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Joseph fulfilled each of those prophecies for Jesus. All right, our next question. And here is one that, folks, we can get very technical with. And in our Wednesday night class on Christian evidences, this is a subject that we're going to talk about more in depth later on. But this question was submitted, and so I wanted to give just a brief answer to this question. How old is the earth? You know, it's a very good question. But as I said, this is a question that can get very deep, can get very technical. And I want to state from the outset that I am indebted to a number of individuals who have devoted years of their life to studying this subject. Just a few, Brother Wayne Jackson, Brother Kevin Smith, and multiple writers with Apologetics Press. I mean, they have devoted countless years of their life to studying this subject among many others. And like I said, this is one that can get very technical. And to be perfectly honest with you, some of the material that I read by these brothers went right over my head. Some of the terminology that they used. And so for lack of better terminology, I'm going to try to dumb this answer down a little bit, at least to the point that I can understand it. And hopefully it'll give you a clear understanding of this as well. Now we all understand that there are a number of different views as to how old the earth is. Those who believe in the atheistic view of evolution believe that at one time all of the elements that we now know as this present creation were just floating around out there in this empty nothingness. And then suddenly one day, and no one can agree what caused this, but suddenly one day there was an explosion. And that explosion produced such heat and such pressure that it fused everything together into what we know as the universe today. Well, those who hold to this view, basing their assumption upon radiocarbon dating of meteorites, they believe that this earth is somewhere between 4.6 and 5 billion years old. Well, this is a figure that was taken from the United States Geological Survey. So this is a pretty credible organization that we can get this figure from. But whenever you look at this concept of radiocarbon dating, or we commonly refer to it just as carbon dating, it has been proven to be very inaccurate. In fact, one of the articles that I read, there were some scientists that took two objects that they knew to be the exact same age. And they carbon tested each one of those objects, and one of those showed to be about 7,000 years older than the other one. But yet, this is the system that so many scientists today want to use to try to determine the age of the earth, the age of historical artifacts, things of that nature. But because of these inaccuracies, we see more and more that archaeologists are beginning to cease using this type of dating. But yet, we see that this continues to be what scientists use to try to determine the age of the earth. But what about those who believe in the biblical view of creation? How can we determine the age of the earth? Now, Brother Kevin Smith, and I do not personally know this man, but he has done a very good job in breaking this down and explaining what I believe to be a very biblical view of the age of the earth. He said from Genesis 1 to Genesis 7, we're able to find evidence through the genealogy that is included there, and we can assume, based on those genealogies, that that period of time from Genesis 1 to Genesis 7 was about 1,656 years. But then the flood took place. And we know that after the flood, we know that certain things changed. People no longer lived as long of lifespans. And from Genesis 11:26 to the time of the Tower of Babel was about 377 years. Then after their language was confused and they were separated and they went and they occupied different parts of the earth, from Genesis 11:31 through Exodus 3 and verse 2 was about 427 years. Now through this time, we have so much biblical history that was taking place. So much of what we find recorded as to what we consider our book of Genesis, or the beginnings of all things, we see included in this initial period of time. At this point, Israel was still not recognized as a political power. They were still just a nation of people that had recently come out of Egyptian bondage. And they were now wandering in the wilderness. Well, from Exodus 14:15 through 1 Kings 6 and verse 7, we find this period of time of the kings and captivity. We find this period from the Exodus to the time of the building of the temple. We find a period of time where people were faithful through the lifetime of Joshua. Then after Joshua, they began to fall away. Judges were brought in to try to restore order. But then after those elders of the people would pass away, that nation would fall away once again. Well, through this period of time, from the Exodus through the kings of Israel and Judah until the time that Judah was carried away into Babylonian captivity, was roughly 412 years. Then from the time of their being carried into Babylonian captivity until the time of the birth of Christ was about 588 years. Then from the time of creation, now think about this, from the time of creation until the time of the birth of Christ, if these figures are correct, and like I said, these are educated guesses based upon genealogies as well as scientific record. If this is the case, then when Jesus was born, this earth was only 3,894 years old. 3,894 years old. Well, then you figure the number of years from 96 AD. 96 AD being the end of the first century. And a lot of times people will determine the age of the earth, at least looking at it from a biblical perspective, based upon different milestones. And we talked about from the beginning until the flood, from the flood until the Exodus, from the Exodus till the time of the kings, from the time of the kings to the time of Babylonian captivity, from Babylonian captivity to the time of the first century or the time of Christ. Well, oftentimes the next step is from the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 up through the modern day. And whenever we consider all of that, when we add all of that up, those of you who know me well, you know I didn't do this addition because I'm not a math whiz at all. We come up with about 5,821 years. It's a whole lot less than billions, isn't it? And most of that, like I said, can be based upon the biblical record and the genealogies that we see contained in God's Word. Now, even if I did the math, and even if we were off by a few thousand years, that's still a lot less than several billion, isn't it? So we know that this earth has not been in creation all that long. It's not been here for billions of years, as scientists would have us to believe. We're still in the thousands of years. Okay, our next question. Are there any Gentiles mentioned in the Old Testament? Well, the short answer is yes. Yes, there are. The Hebrew term that is translated Gentile is found 30 times in the Old Testament. This same Hebrew word is translated nation 374 times, is translated heathen 143 times, and people 11 times. It was a term that originally simply meant a foreigner, someone from a foreign nation. But over time it came to refer to any person who did not come from Israelite descent. And then eventually it branched out and became even more exclusive. And the claim was made that this refers to only those who do not come from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Because those who came out of Babylonian captivity that went back to Jerusalem and rebuilt that society at that point came to refer to themselves as Jews. Prior to that time, they were not known as Jews. They were known as the children of Israel. Well, the Greek term that's translated Gentile in the New Testament is found 123 times, and by this time it came to have this universal view as any non-Jew. Therefore, if we go back into the Old Testament, any person who was not of Israelite descent, or individuals who were not from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, depending upon how exclusive you want to view that term, they would have been considered Gentiles. All right, here we have another question, another very interesting question. Why did God not create Eve in the same way that He created Adam? Well, I'm assuming, I didn't ask the one who submitted this question, but I'm assuming that this is referring to Eve being created from the rib of Adam rather than from the dust of the ground like Adam was. Well, on the 5th and 6th days of creation, God created all of the living things that fly, swim, and walk on the earth. Each of those were created with two genders, male and female. But then, we read in Genesis 1 and verse 22 that all of these creations were told to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply. But on the 6th day, when God made His crowning creation, He only created one gender initially. He created man. He gave this man a job. He told him, go out here and look at all of these living creatures. You know, the image that we see is almost as if God paraded them all past Adam. And so many times I've heard people say, well, it was because Adam was trying to find a mate that was suitable. No, he wasn't. What this was, it was showing him that God has all of these other creations where He has created male and female. But I believe that the most logical view of this is He wanted Adam to understand, at least initially, before creating woman, that God saw mankind, not necessarily the male gender, but mankind as being more unique, more special. And so He created man initially as just one entity. All of these other beings that are not created with a spiritual aspect to them, they were created initially in these physical forms. But man initially was created just as man. But as time went on, the text says God realized that it was not good for man to be alone. Men, any of us who are married, I think we could say a hearty amen to that. It's not good to be alone, is it? We need that helper. We need that helpmate. God understood that all of these other creations, He had created a female counterpart. And so now He determines that He's going to do that for man as well. But then we come to the question, why didn't God just form woman from the dust of the ground like He did man? Why didn't He breathe into her nostrils the breath of life and bring her into existence just like He had created man? Well, there's a lot that we do not know. And apparently, we're not supposed to know why God carried out the acts of creation in the exact way that He did. For instance, why did He use Adam's rib? That's a question that always comes up. Why did He use Adam's rib? Well, through the years, I've heard many preachers make the argument, and I've read as well. They said that man needed a helper. And so woman was not created from the foot of man to indicate that man was to lord over her. Nor was woman created from the head of man, indicating that she would be on a level above man. But she was taken from his side, indicating that they would be equals, that they would be partners. Well, I think Brother Burton Kaufman, in his commentary, presents a very interesting side note to this. He said that research by a man named Elton Stubblefield, he's a gospel preacher and a physician. He said Dr. Stubblefield conducted research into human DNA, and he determined that the rib, now listen to this, that the rib is the only bone in the human body that carries within its structure every type of cell that is necessary to create human life. Think about that. We think about our body and we know that there's brain cells, we know that there's heart cells, there's skin cells, there's all these different cells that have to come together in order to form life. But Dr. Stubblefield, he proved that within the rib you find every type of cell that's found in the other parts of the body. And I think that's amazing. To me, that just indicates once more, as we talked about on the radio program this morning, these scientific proofs that we find in the Bible. It's amazing. So again, and I feel like I'm using this answer so much tonight, we really don't know exactly why God chose to create woman in the way that He did. There's so many interesting things that we see brought out from her creation. There's so many interesting side notes that we see that science has proven in the ensuing years. But what we know is that in doing so, He provided man with a helper that was suitable for Him. And we are out of time for tonight, so we're going to stop there. Appreciate so much the questions that have been submitted. I have several more that we'll get to in the coming months, but please continue to submit questions for our consideration. But tonight, as we bring this lesson to a close, as we always do, we want to take a time of reflection. We want to stop and we want to think for just a moment about our own personal spiritual condition. Ask yourself, am I living a life that's pleasing to God? Have I removed those things from my life that had me separated from God, those sins? And have I replaced that with a faithfulness to the will of God? But if you look at yourself tonight and you cannot say that you're living a faithful Christian life, then we would love to help you with that. If you've never obeyed the gospel, and tonight you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, we encourage you to make a decision tonight that you're going to leave those sins behind. Turn away from the things of this world. Set your sights on things above and come forward. Confess the faith you have in Christ and be baptized. Have your sins washed away. Or if you are a child of God and you've not been living the way that you need to, maybe you've allowed sin to enter back into your life, or you're facing a difficult time and discouragement has come in and has caused you to grow weak and to pull away from your faith. Be restored tonight. Let us go to the Father in prayer on your behalf. Let us study with you and encourage you. There's no reason for anyone to leave here tonight not in a right relationship with God. And so if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come forward at this time while together we stand and sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power?